The last Roman wasn't Roman. We picture the fall as an invasion. Gothic warriors, burning marble, civilization shattered in a single night. That's the myth. But here are the mechanics. The fault line is power. Theoderic, the Ostrogothic king, took Italy in 493. He kept the Senate, kept the laws, kept Roman administrators in power. For 30 years, a Gothic king governed Rome more competently than the last 6 emperors combined. 3 things that had no right to survive. A Roman senator wrote the West's most important philosophical text inside a Gothic prison, waiting to be executed. Courts in Ravenna still read Cicero, while Rome itself sat silent. A Gothic treasury, Roman denominations. When the system finally executed Boethius for loyalty, that was power consuming itself. That was a pattern, and that pattern is running right now. Welcome back to The Roman Pattern. I'm your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate, and every episode in this series is really a forensic look at the actual mechanics of why Rome failed, the structural reasons underneath the dramatic version that everybody already knows. And the thing you start to notice, once you've done a few of these, is that the fault lines keep coming back to the same handful of pressures. It comes down to money, borders, and power. And today, those 3 lines all intersect in a story most people have never heard. It's a story about a Gothic king who kept the Senate running, a Roman philosopher who kept civilization alive from inside a prison cell, and an empire that ended up destroying more of Rome, retaking it, than the barbarians ever did in taking it in the first place. So let's get into it. To understand Theoderic, you have to understand what he walked into. And to understand that, you have to go back to 476. That's the date everybody knows. The fall of the Western Roman Empire. But here's what actually happened that year. There was a 17-year-old boy on the Western throne named Romulus Augustulus. And he'd been put there by his father, a general named Orestes, who held the real power. Romulus had been emperor for 10 months. And in that time, he'd never commanded an army or governed a province. He was a title more than anything, a symbol sitting there where an emperor was supposed to sit. Then a Gothic general named Odoacer led a mutiny of Italian garrison troops and marched on Ravenna. Orestes was killed, and Romulus was removed from power, but Odoacer didn't kill him. He sent him off to a villa in Campania with a pension, and then he sent a letter to Constantinople. That letter carried the imperial insignia eastward, and the message to Emperor Zeno was basically that the West didn't need a separate emperor anymore. One emperor was enough, and Italy would be governed from Constantinople. That letter is the thing most people are pointing at when they say that Rome fell. But here's what the textbooks tend to skip right over. Odoacer ran Italy for 17 years after that, and across those 17 years, almost nothing actually changed. This is the point Peter Heather keeps hammering in The Fall of the Roman Empire. 476 was less a rupture than a change in the bookkeeping. No walls came down that year. The administration just kept running. The Senate still met in Rome. Roman law still applied to Roman citizens. And the consuls were still being appointed every year. A ceremony that reached back to the Republic, close to 1,000 years deep at that point. The grain still came in from Sicily, the aqueducts still ran, and the roads, well, they were still maintained. Odoacer collected taxes using the same Roman administrative machinery, paid his soldiers out of it, and kept the whole bureaucracy employed. So what he was really doing was administering the place, keeping it functioning, because he understood something the last Western emperors had forgotten. The machine only works if you keep it running. The moment you stop maintaining the infrastructure for a single season, you lose a decade of function, and Odoacer wasn't willing to lose that. He even minted his coins in the Senate's name rather than his own, because he understood that his legitimacy was borrowed from Roman institutions. He needed them far more than they needed him, And that idea, this notion of borrowed legitimacy, is the key to everything that comes next. Then in 488, Constantinople made a decision, and a man named Theoderic crossed the Alps. To really get Theoderic, you have to start at the beginning. Back in 461, a Gothic king named Theodemir cut a deal with the Eastern Emperor. His people, the Ostrogoths, had been settled inside imperial territory on the Pannonian frontier, which is modern-day Hungary and Serbia. And to guarantee the peace, Theodemir handed something over to Constantinople. He handed over his son. The boy was 7 years old, and his name was Theoderic. This was completely standard practice in the ancient world. A royal hostage guaranteed good behavior. So if the Goths raided, the boy paid the price for it. But Theoderic wasn't sitting in a dungeon somewhere. He was raised inside the imperial court, educated alongside the sons of the Roman aristocracy. He studied Latin, he studied Roman law, and he studied administration, the actual nuts and bolts of how provinces were governed and tax records were kept, and how armies got supplied. He spent about 10 years watching Roman political culture from the inside. He came back to his people at 18, and here's what set him apart from basically every other Gothic leader of his generation. He had seen the machine up close. He knew how it worked. So he didn't look at Roman civilization as some alien thing to be looted. He looked at it as a working system you could operate, and that one distinction shaped the next 50 years of Italian history. Once he was back, he became co-king of the Ostrogoths, alongside his father around 471, and then the sole king after Theodemir died a few years later. For the next 17 years or so, he was fighting against rivals, against the Eastern Empire, and against neighboring peoples. He understood logistics and supply lines, and strategic patience in a way that most contemporaries didn't. He also wasn't volatile. At one point, he had a rival Gothic leader killed to consolidate his own power, which was a preview of what he'd do later, in person, to Odoacer. Power tends to run in patterns just like that. By 488, the Emperor Zeno had himself a problem. Theoderic and his Ostrogoths were strong enough to be genuinely dangerous inside imperial territory, strong enough to raid, strong enough to threaten, but not strong enough to take Constantinople. So Zeno did the math and made a calculated move. He commissioned Theoderic to go take Italy, remove Odoacer, govern Italy as an imperial viceroy, and in theory, under Constantinople's authority, but in practice with full operational independence. This is how empires tend to outsource the problems that they can't solve directly. You find somebody who both has capacity and ambition. You hand the mission of a coat of legitimacy, and then you accept whatever result comes back. Zeno gave Theoderic the legal cover to conquer Italy. Theoderic gave Zeno a way out of his Ostrogothic problem, and both men understood perfectly well what they were trading. In 488, Theoderic led his entire nation into Italy, not just an army. Every Ostrogoth who followed him, something like 100,000 people, the warriors, the women, the children, and the elderly, along with the livestock and the wagons and everything they owned. It was a migration and a military campaign happening at the same time, which is the borders fault line operating at full scale, and it created a tension that would define his entire reign. You can't settle 100,000 people inside an established civilization without serious disruption, and you can't govern an existing population that's frightened of the newcomers without constant political work. He spent 33 years holding that tension in place, and for most of those years, he'd actually pulled it off. The campaign against Odoacer ran 4 years and came down to 3 major engagements, and Theoderic, well, he won every one of them. After that, Odoacer pulled back behind the walls of Ravenna, the most defensible city in Italy. It was ringed by marshes and supplied by sea. The siege dragged on for almost 3 years, until Odoacer's supply lines finally gave out. Negotiations started, and a settlement got reached. And the deal was that the two of them would govern Italy jointly. So in March of 493, Theoderic invited Odoacer to a banquet to celebrate the agreement, and then he killed him personally, right there at the table. The accounts differ on exactly how, though the contemporary source we call the anonymous Valsenius says that Theoderic drew his sword and ran Odoacer through the collarbone with his own hand. Either way, they agree on the result. And it's worth sitting with that for a second, because the method tells you something about how power actually behaves. Theoderic didn't need to kill Odoacer at that particular banquet. He'd already won the war. He could have exiled the man. He could have locked him up. But he chose to make a statement instead. A statement about what happens to the old source of authority when a new one moves in. Two claims to legitimacy can't sit in the same room. Even a defanged Odoacer, alive and pensioned off and irrelevant, was still an alternative, still a rallying point, still a living question mark hanging over Theoderic's rule. And the murder closed that question for good. This is the power fault line at its most stripped down, and it runs on legitimacy a lot more than ideology. So now Theoderic is master of Italy, and what he builds over the following years is one of the strongest political experiments in late Roman history. But here's what he kept intact. The Roman Senate still meeting, still deliberating, still the symbolic center of Roman public life. The consulship was appointed every year, a ceremony that was already 1,000 years old and reached back to 509 BC. Roman law applied to Roman citizens through Roman courts with Roman judges. The whole imperial bureaucracy, the tax collectors and the record keepers and the grain administrators, and the postal system. He even kept the aqueducts. 11 separate systems feeding Rome, all of them maintained and repaired on his orders. But here's what was new. The army was Gothic. The top military commanders were also Gothic. And a third of Italian estates got formally reassigned to Ostrogothic settlers. That was the price of conquest. So you had two parallel systems running at the exact same time. The Roman civilian apparatus administered everything. The Gothic military class protected it. And one of them governed and one of them fought. And Theoderic stood in the gap between both of them. Even gave the arrangement a name. Civilitas. Civilized order. A Roman order. He used the word in official correspondence, in legal decrees, in his diplomacy. And he wasn't just describing his government when he did it. He was making a political claim. The claim was that he was the continuation of what Rome had been, not the end of it. This is where Mary Beard's reading of Rome in SPQR actually helps. Because her argument is that Rome's real genius was never the marble. It was institutional. It was citizenship and law, and an administration that could outlast any single ruler. And Theoderic was betting his whole reign on that being true. Betting that Rome was portable, that you could run it without having been born into it. The coins reinforced the same message. He minted them in Rome's name, with his own face on one side and Roman symbols on the other, with the Senate's approval required from the mint itself. Gothic treasury, Roman denominations. Every merchant who handled one of those coins was being quietly told that the system was intact, which made the coinage a piece of political communication operating at an enormous scale. The man who made all of this coherent on paper was a Roman aristocrat named Cassiodorus, a senator, a scholar, and an administrator, and Theoderic's effective chief of staff for much of his reign. Every royal edict, every diplomatic letter, and every piece of official correspondence between Ravenna and the outside world, well, Cassiodorus wrote it. And he gathered 12 volumes of that correspondence into a collection which is called the Variae, and still survives today. We can read it. And reading it tells you something pretty remarkable, because it doesn't read like the paperwork of a barbarian kingdom at all. It reads like the correspondence of a Roman administration that just happens to have a Gothic king sitting at the top. The Latin is polished. The legal reasoning is careful. And the same concern shows up over and over, which is to maintain the Roman system, maintain the roads, the courts, and keep the food supply moving. Cassiodorus also wrote a history of the Gothic people, which is mostly lost now, but you can tell what it was doing from the pieces that actually survive. He was arguing that the Goths had ancient ties to Roman civilization. He was building a narrative where Gothic rule wasn't an occupation, but an inheritance. It was propaganda, but it was sophisticated propaganda, because Theoderic didn't only want to rule Rome, he wanted to be adopted as Roman, and that distinction really does matter. Because a conqueror takes, while the successor inherits, and Theoderic was trying to inherit. You can still see the physical evidence of that ambition standing today. He built in Ravenna, his capital, putting up churches and palaces and administrative buildings. All of it in Roman style, with Roman materials, and Roman and Byzantine craftsmen, and an iconographic program, the mosaics and the architectural vocabulary, that was thoroughly Roman. He was constructing his argument in stone, the argument that he belonged inside Roman tradition. For 30 years, for the most part, the argument held. Italy under Theoderic was more stable than it had been in decades. The invasions of the 5th century had shattered any sense of confidence and continuity. The Visigoths under Alaric back in 410, the Huns under Attila in the 450s, the endless run of military coups, and Theoderic's Italy had none of that. The harvest got recorded, the roads got maintained. The grain moved from Sicily to Rome right on schedule. One contemporary source describes the whole period as a stretch of peace that older generations simply hadn't lived through. And the material record backs that up, with archaeological evidence of continual occupation and maintained infrastructure and trade networks that were still functioning. Rome's population under Theoderic was still being counted in the hundreds of thousands, and that number is going to matter, because by the end of the Gothic Wars 50 years later, it would be counted in the tens of thousands instead. The city the Romans wrecked retaking it had been better preserved under the Goths, and that's the central irony running through this entire period. Now, I want to stop here for a second, because this is exactly where most histories of this period go wrong. They treat Theoderic's reign as a kind of pause, a parenthesis, a brief interval of stability before the real story, the Byzantine conquest, gets going. But it wasn't a parenthesis at all. It was an experiment. And the question the experiment was testing was whether Roman system could function without a Roman at the top. For 30 years, the answer was yes. And the conditions under which it stopped being yes will tell you almost everything about the power fault line. There was always a deeper fracture sitting under the surface. And it wasn't military, and it wasn't economic. It was religious. The Ostrogoths were Arian Christians, and Arianism held that Christ had been created by God, subordinate to the Father rather than co-equal with him. The Catholic Church had declared that a heresy all the way back at the Council of Nicaea in 325, which is around 170 years before Theoderic took over Italy. And for that entire stretch, Arianism had been a theological and political wedge, driven through every relationship between barbarian rulers and their Roman subjects. The divide wasn't really about doctrine in the end. It was about identity. Catholic Romans looked at their Arian Gothic rulers and saw foreigners, not just politically. They were foreign in a theological sense too. Men who worshiped Christ differently, who built their own separate churches, who wouldn't take communion alongside their Roman subjects. So the Gothic army and the Roman population shared the same territory and the same institutions, but they never shared an altar. Theoderic's policy was formal tolerance, and for a long time, that held. He didn't interfere with the Catholic Church appointments. He didn't confiscate church property. And when Catholic mobs went after Jewish communities in northern Italy, he stepped in and protected Jewish property rights against the Christian violence. He appointed Catholics to the highest civilian post in his government, as his chief philosopher. His most trusted intellectual was himself Catholic. That man was Boethius, Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius. The name carries the full weight of the old Roman aristocracy, a patrician family, a deep philosophical education, devoutly Christian and thoroughly Roman. He had spent his life doing something almost nobody else in the West was doing, which was translating Greek philosophy into Latin. Aristotle's logical works, Porphyry's Isagoge, Ptolemy on music, Elucid on mathematics. And this matters more than it might sound, because by the early 6th century, educated Romans were losing their access to Greek. The Eastern Empire still spoke it, but the Western world increasingly didn't, which meant the intellectual inheritance of Athens, Plato and Aristotle, and the whole structure of Greek logical thought was slipping out of reach. Boethius understood what that meant for Rome. If nobody translated it now, it would be lost. It wouldn't be destroyed exactly, it would just become unreachable, lost simply because nobody left could read it. So he worked at it systematically, planning to translate the entire Aristotelian corpus, every major work. And he got through the logical works before his arrest. Those translations went on to become the intellectual foundation of the medieval European philosophy. For 600 years, from Boethius right up to recovery of Aristotle, through Arabic sources in the 12th century, Western philosophers worked mainly from his Latin versions. That whole chain of transmission ran through one man's desk in Ravenna, under a Gothic king's roof. In 522, Theoderic appointed him magister officiorum, the master of offices, the highest civilian administrative post in his kingdom. Boethius run the palace administration, coordinated the communications between Ravenna and Constantinople, and handled the schedules and appointments and official correspondence of the entire central government. He was, in practical terms, the most powerful Roman in Italy. And for a year or so, it worked. The Roman philosopher and the Gothic king, the civilian brain and the military commander, the civilitas operating at its absolute best. Then around 523, Boethius was arrested. The charge was treason, and specifically it was secret correspondence with Constantinople. The allegation was that he'd been communicating with the Eastern imperial court and working to undermine Theoderic, passing along information. Was it true? We honestly don't know. Boethius denied it. He argued that the evidence had been fabricated, and he named the accusers, men who had their political reasons to want him gone. None of it helped him. To understand what Theoderic was so afraid of, you have to understand what Constantinople was doing at that moment. In 519, a new Eastern emperor named Justinian I had ended the Acacian Schism, a theological split between Rome and Constantinople that had run about 35 years. And just like that, the Catholic and Orthodox churches were reconciled. For Western Arian rulers, that reconciliation read as a warning. Constantinople was positioning itself as the defender of Catholic orthodoxy, and an Orthodox emperor with a unified church behind him had a perfectly plausible pretext to intervene anywhere Arians happened to be ruling over Catholics, which meant Italy, which meant Theoderic. And Theoderic was in his 70s by now, and no male heir, and his health was disappearing. His kingdom had been built on a delicate balance of Gothic military power and Roman civilian administration, and there was no obvious successor capable of holding that balance together. The tolerance he'd practiced for 30 years had been a personal achievement, an act of political will sustained by one man's judgment. And one man's judgment gets worse with age and fear, as well as paranoia. So in that climate, the suggestion that Boethius was corresponding with Constantinople was explosive, whether he was a genuine conspirator or just a convenient target. The accusation fit the fear, and the fear in a declining system is stronger than any evidence. This is the power fault line at its most recognizable, and we've watched it run through this series before. Stilicho, the half-Vandal general who effectively held the Western Empire together for over a decade, was executed in 408 by the very emperor he'd been serving, on a charge of secret dealings with the enemy. The reality was that the most capable man in the system, and a system in decline, can't tolerate that kind of capability without becoming afraid of it. And now you've got Boethius, the most capable Roman administrator in Gothic Italy, facing the same accusation, the same fear, the same outcome. It's the same pattern, playing out again. Boethius got sent to prison in Pavia, and he was there for about a year, and in that whole year, he wrote. The book he wrote was The Consolation of Philosophy. It's a dialogue between Boethius and a figure he calls Lady Philosophy, who appears to him in his cell, tall and ageless, her robes embroidered with the Greek letters pi and theta, standing for practice and theory. She asks him why he's grieving, and what follows is one of the most sustained meditations on fortune and justice, and the nature of good in all of Western literature. And notice what he doesn't write. He doesn't curse Theoderic. He doesn't write a political treatise. He doesn't even write Christian theology, even though he's a Christian and he's sitting there waiting to die. What he writes is philosophy, in the tradition of Cicero and of Plato, a Roman senator in a Gothic prison, writing like the Rome of 500 years earlier, the Rome of the Republic, the Rome that hadn't yet cracked under the weight of the emperors and debased coinage and barbarian generals. The choice tells you exactly what Boethius believed civilization actually was. To him, it wasn't an army or an institution or a bloodline. It was a set of intellectual habits, preserved through reading, passed on through writing, kept alive by individuals who decide the ideas are worth carrying forward. And he was doing precisely that in his cell, knowing he was going to die. The Constellation went on to become one of the most copied and translated and widely read books in all of medieval Europe. King Alfred translated it into Old English. Chaucer translated it. Queen Elizabeth I translated it. It was read in monasteries, courts, and schools across 1,000 years of European history. It outlasted the Gothic kingdom by 14 centuries, and it's still in print today. Boethius wrote the most important Roman book of the 6th century. He wrote it in a prison cell, and he was executed by a Goth. That's what civilizational continuity actually looks like when you get close to it. It comes down to individuals deciding the ideas are worth passing on, one person at a time. It isn't a triumph, and it has very little to do with the powerful preserving anything from the top. The container was Gothic, the content was Roman, and the content, well, it survived. In 524, Theoderic had Boethius executed. The method was brutal, with the sources describing him bound and beaten to death. Some of them saying a cord was tightened around his skull first. And he also had Symmachus executed, Boethius' father-in-law, the head of the Roman Senate, and one of the most respected men in Italy. Two of the most committed defenders of Roman civilization under Gothic rule, eliminated within roughly the same stretch. After that, the Senate went silent. It wasn't abolished, it just went quiet. The civilitas kept functioning on paper. The decrees were still issued, and the court still sat. But the trust had made the whole thing run. The willingness of Roman aristocrats to genuinely serve a Gothic king, well, that was broken. You can't execute the two most prominent Romans in your own administration and expect their successors to serve with the same conviction. What you get instead is a compliance. Men doing the bare minimum required to stay out of trouble. And that's not the same thing as governance. And it tends to go in a sequence. First, the system starts to feel threatened, and then it turns on the most capable servants, starts mistaking their loyalty for a threat, and then removes the very people who keep it running. After that, it's coasting on compliance rather than commitment. And eventually, it collapses. Not right away, and often not for years. But the real damage is already done. The executions of Boethius and Symmachus didn't end Theoderic's kingdom that day. What it ended was the kingdom's ability to regenerate itself. Theoderic died in 526, in his mid-70s, having ruled Italy for 33 years, which by the standards of late antiquity was an extraordinary run. The grain still came in, the aqueducts still ran, the roads were still maintained, and the Senate still met. But he died without a male heir, so his daughter, Amalthasuntha, took power as regent for her young son, Athalaric. And by every surviving count, she was extraordinary. She spoke Latin and Greek and Gothic. She'd been educated in the Roman tradition, and as she wanted to carry on her father's policy of Roman Gothic integration, she appointed Roman administrators. She worked Constantinople diplomatically, and she understood that the kingdom's survival depended on keeping her father's system intact. But the Gothic military aristocracy rejected her, because they didn't want their sons raised as Roman scholars. They wanted warriors. To them, a Gothic boy who read Cicero and spoke fluent Latin was a Gothic boy being stolen. There was a cultural fracture running right through the Ostrogothic ruling class, one Theoderic held together by sheer force of personality, by his authority and his 33-year track record. Amalthasuntha had none of those buffers. So the military faction forced her to raise an Athalaric in tradition instead. And he died young, somewhere around 17 or 18. His death blamed on drink and dissipation, though account comes to us mainly through Procopius, who's a hostile Byzantine source on the Goths. After that, Amalthasuntha was pushed into a power-sharing arrangement with a Gothic noble named Theodahad, who had promptly had her imprisoned on an island in Lake Balsanina, and then had her strangled. Constantinople used her murder as a pretext. The Emperor Justinian had been looking for an opening, a way to retake the western provinces, and since Amalthasuntha had been a diplomatic contact with him, her death became the trigger. In 535, Justinian sent his general Belisarius to Sicily, and the Gothic Wars began. What followed was 20 years of devastation. And I want to be specific here, because the standard narrative presents the Gothic Wars as Rome's recovery. The Eastern Empire reclaiming its rightful territory, civilization restored. But the evidence shows something very different. And the man who gives us most of that evidence is Procopius, who served on Belisarius' own staff and watched those campaigns firsthand. He's our witness, and he's the one who tells us much of what got broken in the process. Belisarius' campaigns destroyed the infrastructure that Theoderic had spent 3 decades keeping alive. Gothic defenders cut the aqueducts to deny water to besieging armies. Crops were burned to deny them food. Cities were sacked, and the Italian peninsula became a military theater for 20 years straight. Rome itself changed hands 5 times over the course of the war. The city Theoderic had kept several 100,000 people collapsed. And by the time the Gothic Wars ended in 554, the estimates put Rome's population somewhere between 30 and 50,000. From hundreds of thousands down to tens of thousands in 20 years. And the thing that did that to the city was the Roman conquest itself, rolling through like fire through dry grass. The barbarians didn't cause that collapse. The Senate effectively stopped functioning. It wasn't formally abolished. It just quietly stopped existing as anything that mattered. The last recorded meeting of the Senate, the body that had governed Rome since the early centuries of the city, was somewhere around 580 AD, more than 1,000 years of continuous operation. And it didn't end under Odoacer or under Theoderic. It ended in the wreckage left behind by the Byzantine reconquest. Then in 568, barely 14 years after the Gothic Wars wrapped up, the Lombards came down from the north, and Italy had nothing left to defend itself with. The Gothic military class that had protected the peninsula for 70 years was gone, and the Byzantine garrison was spread too thin and funded too poorly to hold the whole country. So the Lombards took most of northern and central Italy within a few years. And they were a different kind of ruler entirely. They weren't Romanized. They didn't use Latin as a political language. They didn't keep the Senate. And they didn't preserve Roman law for their subjects. The whole arrangement Theoderic had built, Gothic power riding on top of Roman institutions, came apart completely. So let me walk you through the fault lines right now, because this is where the 3 threads finally converge. Start with money. Theoderic's kingdom had kept the fiscal infrastructure intact. The tax system worked. Revenue moved from the provinces to the center. The bureaucracy got paid, and the army got funded. The Gothic Wars wrecked all of it. Now the armies had to be paid out of a countryside that was being actively destroyed. The Italian tax base evaporated as the agricultural economy collapsed. And Justinian's Italy just started requiring constant subsidy from Constantinople. It became a fiscal drain from the moment the reconquest began. So the system Theoderic had kept solvent turned into a wound in the Eastern Empire's finances that nobody could close. Then the borders. The Ostrogoths had created something genuinely unusual. A working coexistence where Gothic and Roman landholders shared the same legal and fiscal system. Not perfectly, and not without friction. But that third of the estate that had been handed to Gothic settlers had stabilized over a generation. The Gothic soldiers protecting the Italian population now had a real stake in its prosperity. So they weren't simply occupiers anymore. They were invested. The Gothic Wars undid all of that, erasing 50 years of settlement, and the Lombards who came afterward had no such investment. They were conquerors without the institutional inheritance Theoderic had worked so hard to build. So the whole question of what it meant to be governed and protected and part of a system in Italy got reset to 0. And then the power. Justinian's reconquest was strategically catastrophic. Because he stretched Byzantine resources across 3 major campaigns at the same time. North Africa, taken back from the Vandals. Italy, taken back from the Goths. Spain, partly taken back from the Visigoths. All of it running simultaneously, and the Eastern Empire's finances never really recovered. Within a generation, the Byzantine Italy was too weak to defend itself, too peripheral to be prioritized, and too expensive to be maintained properly. And as a note, we understand it's the Eastern Roman Empire. We're calling it Byzantium here, just to differentiate. Power had concentrated up to Constantinople, and pulling everything toward the center of it destroyed the local system that had actually kept the provinces working. It's the same centralizing failure that brought down the Western Empire in the 5th century, now eating away at the Eastern Empire's ability to hold on to what it had just retaken. And the pattern didn't seem to care which empire was running it at all. So step back and look at the whole arc. Rome falls, but Italy keeps running. A Gothic king takes Italy and keeps the Senate, the law, and the bureaucracy. A Roman philosopher becomes the most powerful civilian in a Gothic kingdom. And then that philosopher gets executed, and the trust inside the system breaks. Theoderic dies, the experiment ends. Rome retakes Italy. The reconquest finished the job. The Lombards arrived, and Italy won't be a unified country again for 1400 years. The fall was never a single moment. It was a process. And the sharpest irony buried in the process is this. The people most committed to preserving Rome at its most fragile moment weren't Roman at all. Theoderic, Cassiodorus, Boethius, who was Roman by blood but working inside a Gothic structure. Even Stilicho before them, the half-Vandal general who held the Western Empire together, right up until the emperor he served had him killed. Outsiders, all of them. People who had looked at Roman civilization from the outside and decided it was worth keeping. Meanwhile, the formal heirs, the emperors and the court factions, the military aristocracies, had spent 2 centuries tearing it apart from the inside. Rome lasted as long as it did because of the people who weren't supposed to be the ones to save it. And that tells you something about how civilizations actually work. They don't survive because of their formal institutions. They survive because particular individuals decide the ideas are worth carrying forward. Cassiodorus copying and preserving the administrative tradition in his monastery at Vivarium. Boethius translating Aristotle at a desk in Ravenna, and then finishing his last book in a prison cell. A Gothic king who repaired the aqueducts. Barbarians who took Rome didn't destroy Rome. They tried to become it. So the tragedy was never that outsiders took over. The tragedy was the system was already so broken by the time they arrived that even the most capable outsiders could only slow down the collapse. They couldn't stop it. And this is the shape of the thing. When a civilization is failing, it doesn't announce the failure. The buildings are still standing. The courts are still in session. The currency is still circulating. The failure isn't the people running the machine. It's when the competent administrators start getting replaced by compliant ones. When loyalty gets valued over function. When the institutions exist to protect the people at the top, instead of serving the people underneath them. When the system starts executing the men who actually make it work. That's when the fall begins. Long before the walls ever come down. It's the same pattern, just a different century. So when you see a system swapping out its best administrators for loyal ones, when competents start getting treated as a threat, when the institutions still work on paper, while the trust inside them drains quietly away, what you're looking at is Ravenna in 524. You're watching the slow execution of the very thing that made the system work. Boethius gave fortune a voice in the Consolation, the book he wrote in that cell, and the line is hers. Quote, "This is my art. This is the game I will never cease to play. I turn the wheel that spins. I delight to see the high come down and the low ascend." End quote. He was describing how the thing actually works. Not good fortune or bad fortune, but the wheel itself. The pattern that grinds on regardless of who happens to be standing on top of it at that time. He was executed within a year. His book survived 15 centuries. The wheel kept turning, and it's still turning now. This has been The Roman Pattern. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. Please like this video, leave us a comment, and smash that subscribe button if you want more of the Roman pattern.